I'm good. Okay.
Rick, in a couple minutes, will you put Lucy out front? When she's done eating? Huh? She should be awake. Put Lucy out front. She's done. What?
He's always been out here.
What? Let me see.
This stuff.
Oh yeah, that stuff stays good forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Emily.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Alright, we'll wait for people. Let me get right in here. Hi, Julia.
I got dirt on my boot.
Jacob.
Ulrich. Shmoo. check your Etsy and all that. I don't know if you have to download like.
We have another week off.
No, because I'm getting notices that you guys are doing this week. You're doing like you're going to be getting on Etsy and all of that to start to learn how to use that software, and you're going to be turning in assignments and stuff, but it's very like you're slowly like easing into it. So I just want you to check to see what software you might need or whatever. Oh, hey guys, we'll wait a couple more to see who shows up before we start, okay? I appreciate you guys for making it. Makes it a lot better for me because I feel like I'm not just talking to myself. 'Cause I hate that. Um, I'll just give it like 5 more minutes, okay? So if you want to grab a drink or something like that, feel free. All right, I'm gonna grab myself a drink. Okay, be right back. Okay. Yeah. Not bad, babe. Just got work. I'm sorry. What are you doing? What you doing?
I think people may be on the most recent link that was sent. I think they might be waiting for that one because that's the first one I went on.
Oh, really? Hold on a second.
I went on that one too, but it said this meeting was for March 20th, so that's why I came to this one.
Okay. Let me hold on. Let me go back. Here. Let's look at this. Let's look at this. Let me copy this link. I'll go to Blackboard and make sure that people know where they're supposed to be. Mhm. Okay. Okay. Maybe I'll just start doing that from now on and just putting the link in the announcement. Oops, forgot to email it. Good. No, I think I did. Email maybe. All right. All right, so I sent a, hopefully you guys see it and hopefully other people see it. Give it a couple of minutes to see if somebody, if anybody shows up.
Great.
Oh, hi Emma.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you? Good to see someone else. Let's see if other people pop up. Savon. Good to see you. I know I'm slaughtering your name. I'm so sorry. Can you say it properly for me?
It's Savon.
Savon. Oh, okay. So I was rightish.
Yeah, it
Okay.
looks super easy to say like phonetically, but then it like throws you off because there's such weird letters put together.
Right. Yeah. I thought it was, I think I said it right the first time, but then I thought,
Yeah,
yeah.
I got you though. Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. I can see your face, even though you're not there. I was like, I know who it is. But anyway, hey, Lucy. I know, baby. He's like, you're here, but you're not petting me. All right, we'll give it a couple more minutes. We'll wait until about 10 after and see if other people pop in. All right, so make yourselves comfortable for a few and I'll come right back, okay? All right, come on, you. What you doing? Okay. Ah, who's that? Let's see. There's Jennifer Simmons, Jack. Hold on. Ricky. Let's see. Hold on. Why am I'm just trying to see out who's here. Kyla. Oh. All right. Hi, everybody. So, okay, hold on. Let me kind of like this. All right. So let's see, where did we leave off? We talked about civic culture. Okay. Oh, so I guess it was right here. Okay. All right, so hold on, let me move the little window with you guys in it. All right. No, bounces back down. All right, so it says that let me think what we were talking about. So we're talking about like Robert Putnam and his work in Italy and the United States. And so as I was talking about before, how he ended it is that he was saying that the work in Italy was sort of a warning for the United States, but also in a way kind of for the rest of the world, right? That a move away from these civic organizations was bad for democracy, okay? Because his idea is that these groups, not only did they perform a general function in day-to-day society, right? Let me go back to this one thing here, right? So not only did they perform this, sorry, hold on. Did they, I can't. Not only did they perform this important function in day-to-day society, right? But his thesis basically states that, you know, when democracy is threatened, right, that it would be these sorts of people that they'd be the ones who would get together and be more likely to act to try to save democracy, right? The ones who join these civic groups, who are active to create this sort of civic culture. Those people who are the kind that are generalized trusters, who trust the people they don't know enough to join these kinds of groups, right? Of course, there's a lot of people who would say things like, and one of them, there's this guy, Usliner, and he says, well, you know, when you join these types of groups, right? So say you join the Masons, or that I talked about before, that my great-grandfather is a member of the Templars, and, you know, whatever. Or specifically say the Knights of Columbus, right? Which I said was a Catholic group, right? You may not specifically know some of the individuals in that group, but you know something about them, right? So you have an idea of what their morals and their values might be. So you know they're not wholly unknown quantities, if that makes sense. So, you know, you're joining groups with others that, you know, are like you in some important ways, right? So that would be sort of one, I don't know if it would be a critique per se, but a sort of like asterisk to this notion of generalized trusters, that generally when you're joining these groups, that they're not wholly unknown people, right? Whether it's a bowling group, right? Because for Robert Putnam, unlike some other people, like perhaps like Robert Inglehart, Robert Putnam would say, you know, they don't have to be political in nature, right? Lucy, you're not going out by the pool right now, baby. She loves to go out by the pool and relax, you know. She's a bit of a diva that way. Anyway, so, you know, Robert Putnam would say they could be bowling groups, something as simple as even a bowling group, whereas Inglehart and some others would say that, you know, no, they should be somewhat political in nature, whether it be to work towards dealing with poverty, or, you know, conservative values or liberal values or whatever, like that sort of thing. But again, as Robert Putnam's work here, Bowling Alone, suggests, he doesn't care, right? You could be in a literal bowling league or a golfing league or a knitting group or something like that, and he would say that that's fine too, right? Because you're building these community networks, right? But anyway, so I digress. So, oops, sorry. So, civic culture with a question mark. So, these studies, obviously, they're important, and they are an improvement on Mill and Montesquieu, right? Particularly Mill, because they say what is important about culture that matters, right? So they get more into detail. So remember when we were critiquing about them, Montesquieu did say a little bit about some of these things, but Mill was a lot more vague. But of course, there's still problems. We need to know what the causal relationship between economic development and culture is, right? So there's one called, Lucy, stop it. Shh, shh, you're not going outside right now. The economic development, democracy, and culture, which is the value story, which Inglehart talks about. Okay. Oops, sorry. Let me move the little box here. Hold on. Jesus. I'm sorry. Hold on. Stop it. No, stop it. I'm sorry. I'm trying to move the box where you guys are. Hold on. And it doesn't let me see the arrow, so it's like really kind of difficult. Hold on. There we go. Okay. No, I need to go over. I can't see the arrow, so I don't know. Nope, stop it. Please stop. Stop it. Oh, don't do that. Maybe if I just go, like, I'll just click through this thing and it'll, okay. I'm so sorry. We're getting through this thing as best we can. Okay. There we are. Okay. So, or the institutional story, which Mueller and Singleton talk about, and also Singleton, okay, which says that economic development, culture, and democracy, which economic development drives culture, which drives democracy. Okay. So what does the empirical evidence suggest? Okay, so Inglehart and Wiesel, they talk about that societal development causes individuals to favor self-expression over security. And it is this cultural shift that fosters democratization. So self-expression in survey responses related to life satisfaction, interpersonal trust, post-materialism, which we talked about, like homosexuality, and signing petitions. Okay. And there's considerable evidence in support of the value story and negligible support of the institutional story. So what we find is that people value this notion of self-expression, okay? And that through survey research, we see that there's, you know, these high levels of life satisfaction, like I was talking about before, right? Through Inglehart's work, the interpersonal trust, we can demonstrate the notion of post-materialism, right? You know, people valuing that they can express themselves, you know, if they are homosexual, right? Or even transgender, or, you know, lesbian, or, you know, whatever particular trait that they are, right? And that they have the ability to, you know, protest and sign petitions and do all these things, right? That those things are important to them, right? So that shows that it has more evidence for the values story, okay, than Stingleson and Wiesel's story, okay, or not Wiesel, whatever. All right. So in the institutional story, cultural values are a consequence, not a cause, of democracy. Okay, so economic development drives democracy, which drives culture. Okay, so we would first estimate the effects of development on culture, okay, and then see how those effects change once we control for democracy. All right. Only a small portion of the effect of development on culture operates through democratic experience. So more evidence for the value story than for the institutional theory. The ideas, they might end up just sort of reinforcing each other. That's sort of like endogeneous sort of like loop, right, where you can't sort of you know, pull them apart. Okay. So again, like I talked about before, there's this huge literature that's been built on the methodology of the civic culture, right? Alman and Verba's work. And political scientists, we use a lot of survey research to determine people's attitudes about democracy, okay? And we use those surveys to make inferences about how luckily democracy is able to survive in those specific countries. First, we're going to look at some terms because they're really important to understand how surveys function, right? So there's social desirability bias. That refers to the tendency, by definition, of individuals to I don't want to say the wrong word here. Overreport good behavior and underreport bad behavior. Okay. Hold on. Gosh.
Bless you.
Thank you. Can anybody think of an example of, like, think of a survey and think of an example of when somebody might want to overreport good behavior or underreport bad behavior? Like, think of a question that somebody might ask in a survey. Anyone? Anyone have any thoughts?
What type of survey?
Like any kind of like survey that you could, like, not like anything, just any kind of survey that you could think of, because surveys can cover lots of topics, right? So whatever you can think of.
Ask like for your gender or like your age group or something like that.
Well, we're talking about behavior, like your specific behavior, things that you might do. Do you know what I mean? Not necessarily who you are, but the way you might behave. So questions that would get at how you would generally behave.
Like scenario-based questions. Like, hey, if this happens, what would you do in this situation? So you can kind of see how everybody would.
Yeah, they could be. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, generally, yeah. I mean, can you think of something like that? Maybe.
I guess it's kind of like when I took my psychology class, like they would ask us a lot of like, or my sociology class, they would ask us a lot of like scenario-based questions. They'd be like, hey, like it was more like as like a bystander. They'd be like, hey, like what would you do if you saw this situation happen? And like some people be like, oh, I would help, and then some people like, oh, I would just stand. So I guess that's kind of like trying to figure out your behavior,
Right.
per se.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yes. That's definitely the kind of question that, could be asked of you in any type of survey. Right. And because, I mean, it's not limited to just, these types of that you would think, right? Okay. So let's think of, can I hold that thought, Savon? Okay. I don't want to give it away because you're going in a really good direction, but I don't want to give it away. Anybody else? Anyone else? No. Hi, Josh. Or is it Yosh? It's
Hi,
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Yeah.
So we're asking if you can think of an example where somebody might over-report good behavior or under-report bad behavior in a survey. Any survey. Like if it's like given to you either over the phone, in person, like, like a written survey or, whatever. You don't have to answer it if you can't think of one, but oh, good Lord, my dog. Lucy, stop it. Anyone? Okay, let's think of this, right? So one thing that political scientists are interested in, right, is like things like political violence, right? Or like, and part of that could be like things like white nationalism, right? Or stuff like that. And so you can't just in a survey ask somebody, are you a racist? You know, because most people are just not going to answer that question yes, right? Because they've been socially conditioned for various reasons, okay, to answer no to that question. And even if they feel it very strongly, especially if they have political motivation, they might answer no because they don't want to get busted or, you know, whatever it is, right? So they're going to underreport that, even if the survey is, you know, done by somebody like Gallup and it's over the phone. They might be suspicious or worried, you know, that somehow it can be traced to them. Okay. And people are embarrassed, even if it's the average person, okay, like me or, you know, just your next door neighbor, right? They are talking to another human being, right? And they are embarrassed, right? So there's a lot of psychology on this, right? They will be embarrassed to actually come out and admit this over the phone or in a, you know, office filling out a survey, or even at home because it's been sent to their address. Do you know what I'm saying? It's, the survey has been sent to their address, right? And so they get anxious to answer a question that's that blunt. Do you know what I mean? Right? So they're not going to answer the question, are you a racist? Honestly, now, there are outliers who absolutely will. Okay? But they're outliers, meaning there's very few of those people. Okay? So if you're looking at a normal distribution out in the little tiny wings here, there will be very few people, okay, who are going to answer that question, honestly. Okay? So anyway, so how then would we answer those questions, right? So what we would do, Savon, what were you saying again?
I was saying more so like situational based questions. So definitely like if like so say you see like a crime happening, like you see like somebody's purse getting snatched or whatever, and like you're standing as an innocent like bystander, like what would you do in that situation? That could kind of show people's behavior. People might be more likely to be like, oh, I would help, but like when they really wouldn't, like they wouldn't say very often that they wouldn't really help, you know?
Right. So in a kind of, oh my gosh, let me go look and see if there's like somebody standing in my yard. It's probably not. I'm sure that there's like a cat in my yard or something. Hold on just 1 second. Oh wait. No. Mostly it's just Ricky. It's Ricky and his people. Just stop it. Stop it. She's barking at my neighbor. Anyway, so the situational thing that Savon was talking about, right? So what you would do is you might, one thing that, so when political scientists want to find out if what percentage of, say, the US population or a certain group that they've surveyed are racist, right? They will ask certain types of questions that go around that, okay? And we'll get to that question without directly asking it, okay? And they did this by working with psychologists and sociologists, okay, to find out how to sort of indirectly ask those questions, okay? And so they'll do things by asking sort of somewhat situational questions. Oh, I am so sorry. I put up with this all the time. She thinks she's being a good guard dog. Anyway, and it's just my neighbor going back and forth to his truck. He's, anyway. Anyway, so they'll do things like say, in the United States, in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act was passed because, blah, 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 and give a little bit of background, right? Do you think that, the time has come to end affirmative action because, it's something like because people of color seem to have more rights than white Americans now, right? Or something like this, right? I forget what the wording is. There's some question that's kind of like that, right? And then they have other questions that are like that, okay? And they're situational, right? And sometimes they'll talk about like things like Black Lives Matter or, like different, things and, or comments, made by other people and, stuff like that. So they get around these things, right? And based on answers to those questions, right, then they determine, and it's not just, and it's multiple questions, right? I think I don't remember, it's something like 10 or 15, maybe even 20 questions or something like this, right? Depending upon the specific questions, right? They can get to whether or not a person is actually racist, right? And they're Likert questions. They're not just yes, no, typically. Like what's your degree of agreement with this question? Like very much agree, somewhat agree, neither agree or disagree, somewhat agree or somewhat disagree or very much disagree, right? So they're like 5-level questions. And so depending upon the makeup of your answer to all of these different questions, they can determine whether or not specific respondents are racist. Okay. And so that's how they come to the answer to that question, right? And so they kind of get people that way. But anyway, and of course it's the same thing with like good behavior, right? So because people lie, right? This is the problem with social science, right? And I think we talked about this a little bit early in the semester, right? That this is one of the most difficult problems in relation to social science, right? That people talk about that social science is a mushy science because of because we deal with human beings, right? And that human beings have high variance, and the high variance because of stuff like, people vary from person to person. To when you're talking about stuff like this, people lie. Okay. And so how do you account for that? Right. And so this kind of stuff, like we have to like really, we have to try really hard to work around and think about every variability, right? And so these are the kinds of things that we have to do in order to account for the high variance of human beings, right? And here's another one, differential item functioning, right? And I've kind of talked about this a little bit too. It refers to the fact that different terms, such as particular survey questions, may function differently across individual individuals or groups. DIF exists when individuals or groups understand survey items differently or evaluate them using different scales. Now, can anybody think of how different people might think of different terms? Anybody think of one that might be different to different people? Mean different things? This one might be a little bit more tricky. Hold on. All right, let me do it. So, okay, I think I may have discussed this with you guys. I don't know. So forgive me if I haven't. So, you know, that in the in Russia, right, during the fall of the Soviet Union, okay, 1991, people were super happy. And we're going to talk more about this, I think, in the next chapter, but just real quick. People were super happy, right? They were, you know, really excited, you know, democracy, woohoo, they wanted democracy and all that fun stuff, right? But then, okay, democracy happened, right? And with a combination of the US economists who came and didn't really understand anything about Russia, and the Russian reformers who decided that they were just going to pull out the economy out from underneath them without working to create strong democratic institutions to support them. It ruined people's lives in a really horrific way. Okay, people were losing their livelihoods. People were losing their life savings. People were becoming homeless for the first times in their lives. Women were having to turn to prostitution, and I'll get into a lot more detail later. But the word democracy became nothing to them. Okay, this word that they thought was like a life send became like this, you know, evil word, right? And in many ways, it's not that it's evil so much anymore, it just doesn't mean anything, right? They're like, if this is democracy, screw this, right? Like, you know, it's like, be careful what you wish for, right? They got it and it did nothing for them, right? And so in Russia, the word democracy doesn't mean, it's like they don't know what it really means. Do you know what I mean? They have some vague idea of what it's supposed to mean, but it doesn't function, it doesn't mean the same thing, okay? So when you ask Russians about the importance of democracy, you'll often get very mixed results, particularly by age groups, because they have no concept of what that word means. Okay, I mean, they do, but they don't. You know, they only have bad experiences with it, right? They don't have good experiences, all right? And so this happens when you have groups that have, like I said, negative experiences with terms, or have never experienced it at all, okay? So, or just from a cultural perspective, it may literally just mean something completely different, okay? And so, for example, with the World Value Survey, which I talked about a little bit before, when they ask, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say your support for democracy is, right? You're going to get in different country contexts, right? Wildly different answers to that, okay? And it's not necessarily that some people don't necessarily support some democratic values, what we would see as democratic or civic values, right? It's just that that word is so volatile for some people. Okay, so it can be kind of hard, right? It'd be better if they perhaps defined the word, but they don't, right? So, like, understanding that democracy means this, how would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? That perhaps might be better, but they don't do that.
Could socialism be like another word that like some people
Yes.
might see differently?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that one drives me absolutely bonkers. So many people have this presumption that, you know, socialism equals communism. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily. You know, like we talked about, number one, there's never been a actual communist country. But number two, you know, there's a difference between like, you know, Cuba versus, you know, Denmark or Norway, right? There's a difference between even actual Marxism and the USSR, you know, it's just really, you know, anyway, I digress. But yes, that's a, between Marxism and Marxism-Leninism, even though they put the word Marxism in there. So anyway, the World Value Survey. Yeah, I was talking about that just a second ago. So they've conducted interviews in 80 societies. They're one I use for my research. They address issues of socio and cultural political change. So democracy has problems, but it's better than any other form of government. That's right. That's how they word that question. Could you please tell me if you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly agree? Right. That's one of their questions, right? There's another one that rates it 1 to 10. So obviously, I kind of gave you the answer to that already, sorry. This is kind of problematic given the DIF, right? Because people have different concepts, right? Not only that, but in general, surveys can be difficult to use in dictatorships, okay? So even if they were allowed, right, sometimes it's hard to know whether or not you're going to get a real answer from people, okay? Some people, like in North Korea, right, thinking of extreme examples, or like Saudi Arabia, right? You know, do you really think that if you went to like North Korea or like Saudi Arabia, if we asked them, you know, how they felt about democracy, that it was better than any other form of government, do you agree, disagree, strongly agree, whatever, do you think you'd get a real answer, right? Probably not, right? Because people would be scared to answer these questions honestly, right? Because they would feel like the government's watching them, right? That, you know, that they could get in trouble for honest answers. There's also lots of questions about gender and about how women are treated and things like that. And then definitely in Saudi Arabia, you know, those kinds of questions, people are not going to give honest answers to. Let's see. Let's accidentally touch that. So, and as I talked about, people can understand the same question very different ways. Okay. People measure their health differently, right? For example, there was some quote about here, okay, about India or whatever. How did this get? This should be here. But you can read that later in your own time. It's up there. You know, people measure their health differently. You can also think about just a very easy one without having to read that long quote. It's kind of, I don't want to read a quote that long, but just think about, like, say people in Nordic countries, right? So for example, in the current situation that we're in right now, okay, Norway issued a statement, a sort of order to their citizens, and were like, they said basically like, look, you guys need to come home wherever you are in the world now, you know, especially they said if you're in a country that has, you know, poor healthcare like the United States, right? Because we're going to be closing the borders, right? And, you know, you need to come home. Okay. So, you know, if you ask a question about the state of your healthcare, okay, some people in the United States who maybe haven't gotten sick yet that have private healthcare might think, oh, my healthcare is, you know, fine. Yet, say someone who is who has lived in a Nordic country, right, temporarily, okay, and then is living here or something, or from a Nordic country and who is now a citizen here or something like that, right, would be like, the healthcare here is terrible, right? Even if they had like the same insurance or something like that. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the concepts of how people from different countries perceive the state of healthcare very widely. Hold on just one second. My son has my laptop cord. Elric, I'll be right back. Elric, I need the laptop cord. Laptop cord. Where is it?
I don't know. Ask yourself that because I didn't move it.
Oh, I know where it is.
You got it?
Yeah. Thanks. So, all right. So, we ask ourselves still, is there any reason that measuring the reality of democratic stability on the basis of people's attitudes or perceptions about democracy might cause similar problems to the health example? And the answer is probably. So some people are going to evaluate democracy kind of like what I was talking about before in terms of economic and social equality, but other people evaluate democracy in terms of procedures rather than outcomes. So some people are looking at, you know, how are they doing specifically? So like in the Russia example, you know, people are, you know, falling apart from an economic perspective, a social perspective, but they were also falling apart too, from a procedural perspective, right? They didn't have any democratic institutions. From a judiciary perspective, there was no judiciary to protect people from one another, right? If they were getting ripped off by somebody, which was literally happening, which we'll talk about later, left and right, they would take, if they took somebody to court, the judge literally would rule to the highest bidder, right? Because judges were being paid off. Okay. So they were kind of getting it from both ends. Okay. So political scientists can't agree on how to measure and evaluate democracy, right? So like we've kind of talked about this before, right? Should we look at the minimalist view? Should we look at the substantive view, right? And it really depends. Like, I mean, most people say you would look at the minimalist view, but some people still do argue that, you know, that while looking at the minimalist view is easier, right, for measurement, looking at the substantive view is still really relevant, because what you're talking about, right, are the actual outcomes for the people, right? It's important to look at, yes, the institutions and all of that, but so what if the institutions are functioning if they aren't producing outcomes for people, right? So it's great that you can get this 3,000 level view, but you still need to be able to look at how they are producing for the people that they're meant to work for, right? So there's still that debate, right? Do we look at the generalizable view of how the institutions work, you know, generally across multiple nations, right? Or do we look at specific cases and do the...
Woke up for no reason because she changed the times back to class time. I'm on right now.
Sorry. Anyway, so let's see, where was I? So that's the question, right? So what does the data say? So the question is whether or not we should study democracy, not the argument between, you know, which minimalist or substantive. Okay. So this is the question about democracy may have problems, but it's better than any other form of government. Could you please tell me if you strongly agree, 1, disagree, 2, or strongly agree, or strongly disagree, 4, okay? So now if you look at this picture here, right, we've got Bangladesh at the top, okay, Norway, number 2, Croatia, West Germany. So this was in what year again? This had to have been in the 90s or 80s, I mean, hold on. 95, okay. So anyway, they still separated Germany to tell the difference between West and East. So, anyway, so Norway, blah, 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 right? So what you see here is from left to right at the bottom here, you see an increasing disagreement with this statement, okay? So they strongly disagree with this statement that democracy is better than any form of government, okay? And as you can see in 1995, okay, Russia, more than any country, strongly disagreed, okay? The USSR had fallen apart in 1991, like I talked about, right? They were in the full, hold on, it's my door. Albert, can you help me? I wasn't supposed to be here until later this afternoon. My Publix delivery is 2 hours early. Sorry about that. Anyway, so you see a increasing disagreement with this statement here, like I said, and like I talked about, Russia, you know, was falling apart at that time. They were very unhappy with democracy by this point, right? So it makes sense that they are very low with their increasing disagreement. And it also makes sense that they are very low on democratic stability. Okay, so this is increasing democratic stability. So Bangladesh is the highest on democratic stability here. Norway is the second highest. Croatia, this is in 1995. Okay. Dominican Republic, West Germany, even though they had, you know, were unified at that point. All right, they were still kind of unsure how that was going to go. Okay, so they were measuring them separately. Nigeria, Argentina, USA, okay, all the way down here, Poland, East Germany, all right, etc. All right. Now, here's the question that they ask in relation to support for gradual change, which, you know, Alman and Verba had come up with in Civic Society, and Engelhardt also were looking at, right? So increasing support for gradual change, the question is, do you think that the entire way our society is organized should be radically changed by revolutionary action? 1, that society should be gradually improved by reforms. 2, or that our present society should be valiantly defended against all subversive forces, right? So increasing support for gradual change is here, okay? So Norway is on top, as you can see, okay? Azerbaijan is on the bottom, okay? And right there, pretty much along with Russia, okay? Ukraine, Latvia, Armenia, Nigeria, Azerbaijan, all right? So they are the ones that are feeling that they need pretty much either immediate or, you know, pretty close to immediate change, okay? And the rest are either, let's see, are that are gradually, or that our present society, no, hold on. That our society should be gradually improved by reforms, okay? Some gradually improved by reforms starts about here-ish, okay? And then goes up. But the rest of them want some sort of big change, okay? All right. And then increasing democratic stability, as you can see, okay? So, oh, this book was the bane of my existence. when I was an undergrad, we had to read this as a political science major. And let me tell you, if any of you are poli-sci majors, I know a few of you are, you're very lucky you don't have to read this. I'm white, obviously, and I was offended by this book. Okay. So this dude, Samuel Huntington, it's why I just always have to laugh about, you know, professors being so liberal. Because this dude, he was a professor at Harvard. Anyway, it's unbelievable. So this guy he gets me so angry. And it sucks because he had a couple of really decent books, like Third Wave, which was really influential in relation to, you know, democratization of the Third Wave, which was influential and helped, you know, people who were studying Eastern Europe, like I was, and, you know, Russia. And then this, like, anyway. So he says, conflicts in the world will be cultural rather than ideological or economic. Says the fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. Okay. So civilization, he says, a civilization is the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species. Okay, so this is how he breaks down the different civilizations. Okay, Western, Confucian, Japanese. Now, mind you, Western. So just think about that for a second. Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and African. Okay. Civilizations are primarily coded in terms of religion. Okay. So, clash of civilizations, okay, he says that the Western belief in the universality of the West's values and its insistence on opposing those values through democratization efforts will only antagonize other civilizations and lead to conflict. That sounds reasonable, okay, but he doesn't mean it the way you think he means it. He doesn't mean it in a reasonable sense. So he says, Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equal liberty, and the rule of law, democracy, free markets, separation of church and state often have little resonance in Islamic, Confucian, Japanese, Hindu, Buddhist, or Orthodox cultures. Okay. Pregnant pause. Certain cultures, he says, are incompatible with democracy. Islamic and Confucianist countries cannot sustain democracy, he says. Catholic countries will find it hard to sustain democracies. And when he says that, he's thinking of like Latin America, you know. Violent conflict will be particularly prevalent between Muslims and non-Muslims. Like when I was reading this, like really, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of, oh God, why am I forgetting it? Nostradamus. Has anybody heard of Nostradamus? Yeah. Like his like main predictions were basically kind of like this, right? And his predictions, like he was what, like in like the, I forget, like 1400s, 1500s or something like this, right? About this clash between, you know, the Muslims and the West, right? And it'd be this big war, right? And so when after I read, we had to read this book, and my white male professor was like, so anybody have any thoughts about this? I was like, it seems to me like this guy just like ripped off Nostradamus's like works, you know? And my professor was just like, anybody else? I mean, really, it was just like, I was sitting there. I mean, because we had, you know, people who were clearly Muslim, you know, and then of course, he's also sort of like low key ripping on Latin Americans and, you know, Buddhists and other people. And it's like, you know, people from Asian countries and stuff like this. And I couldn't imagine being, I mean, I'm Catholic, right? But he didn't know that. I'm just this white person sitting in the class, right? But it's like, you know, I couldn't imagine being a person of color sitting in a class being forced to read this book. And at the time, people were taking this book seriously. Okay? It helped to form leaders. Oh, you're not going out to lay by the pool. Be quiet. Shh, shh. It helped to form certain leaders in our country, their foreign policy understandings about Muslims in particular. Okay? So this is why it's important to understand and know about this book, because it helps to give you context about where these ideas come from with our leaders of a certain age. Okay? Because even if they were out of college by then and already in positions of power, they were told, read this, right? Or told about it and given the Cliff's Notes of it or something like this, right? This is the primer that we're working off of, okay? So arguments like this linking religion to democracy have a long history, all right? So Protestantism, Max Weber, he said that it promotes democracy because of its connection to capitalism and development, modernization theory. We kind of talked about that a little bit, right? Protestantism's emphasis on the individual responsibility furthered emergence of democratic values, right? Lipset talks about this. The development of Protestantism, and in particular, the nonconformist sects, has been considered vital to the development of stable democratic institutions in Britain, the Commonwealth, and the United States, Amen and Verba. Catholicism, Lipset, Huntington, 1993. Catholicism is antithetical to democracy. Catholicism's emphasis on there being only one church and one truth, seen as incompatible with democracy, need to accept various different and competing ideologies is legitimate. The hierarchy in the Catholic Church, distinction between clergy and laity, seen as posing problems for the acceptance of the more social and politically egalitarian institutions such as democracy. So there is, there was some discussion of that, and I talked a little bit about that in class from, the perception of, the people, particularly in the Enlightenment, right, that hierarchy didn't allow for individualism, right, and, for the first time, this notion that people are individuals And because now they don't need a priest anymore to talk to God, that now, you know, they have meaning and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, they can move along the social ladder and stuff like that. So that was the perception through the Enlightenment. Okay. So Confucianism, according to Huntington, he says that Confucian democracy is a contradiction in terms, and that no scholarly disagreement exists regarding the proposition that traditional Confucianism was either undemocratic or anti-democratic. Okay, so the Asian values debate of the 1990s, others argue that Confucianism's respect for authority and its emphasis on communalism made it incompatible with democracy. So this is the biggie. Islam, for Huntington, he said that several arguments had been given for this, right? He said that Islam has a violent streak, okay, that predisposes Islamic countries to authoritarianism. He believes that Islam is unable to dissociate itself from political spheres, and that Islam inherently sort of sees women as being unequal. Okay. Now, going back to this one where he says that Islam sees women as inherently equal, this is wholly untrue. If we go back to the beginning of Islam, right, the Prophet Muhammad actually did more for women's rights from a historical perspective. If you talk to any Islamic historian, and I don't mean like religious, somebody within the religious structure of Islam, I mean an actual historian. Go find a white one if you don't trust somebody else. But anybody will tell you that the Prophet Muhammad was, you know, very much believed in, particularly for that time, promoting women's rights, again, from a perspective of that time period. At the time, people were often, you know, in killing female babies, for example, right? And he stopped that practice, and he would say to people, you know, when you die, the souls of your female children that you killed will be there asking, you know, why you killed me, right? And so he made female infanticide illegal, right? And he did things like allowing women to own an inherent property after the deaths of their husband, to be able to, you know, divorce their husbands, which was a big deal, right? Particularly for that time period, we're talking about like 600 AD, okay? These were things that were not allowed in the Judeo-Christian world, okay, of Europe at that time period, right? So this is, you know, this is a big deal. They were allowed to own businesses. They were allowed to hold some political positions, right? Like his wife was seen as pretty much his equal, right? And people often talk about that he was, one of the things I see a lot, which drives me insane, is that he was a pedophile. But that's a slander, right? That that any historian will tell you, that people, even in the Christian world at that time, if they had money and position, that they would sometimes arrange marriages at very early ages, even before the age of 10, before puberty, but and actually get married at that age, but they would not actually go to the husband's home until after they reached puberty. And you have to remember of the time that we're talking about, even Christians were marrying after the age of puberty. So we're talking, as soon as a girl had a period, she was getting married. Okay, they would try to marry her off, right? And she'd be having babies and all that kind of stuff. That was very common for that time period, even among Christian and Jewish households. So when he married his wife young, I forget what age, but she did not enter his house as officially his wife until after she had reached puberty. But anyway, so, and she was seen as a political equal to him. But anyway, so now religion and democracy. Although the argument that some religions are incompatible with democracy have their supporters, there are good reasons to doubt the veracity. Okay, so of course there's going to be this common thread that something in the doctrines, okay, there's something about them that makes them inherently incompatible. Okay, the problem with that and the critique is that you can find something in every religion, okay, literally every religion, that's going to make them incompatible with democracy, okay, and something can be interpreted anyway, right? So, for example, people will look at something in the Quran that talks about killing the infidels or whatever, but you have to, take that in context, right? I've read the Quran. You can also look at the beginning of the Quran, and in the first chapter, it says that that you shouldn't try to convert the Jew or the Christian because they are people of the book. Okay, and what that means, people of the book, that means people of the first few books of the Bible, right? Because we follow that, right? Muslims still follow the Torah, right? Which is, again, the first few books of the Bible. So do Christians, right? And also Muslims believe in Jesus, right? Which is also a common misconception, etc. And so, and also it says that you shouldn't try to convert them because, God knows their heart, right? And knows that they're people of the book and we're all brothers and stuff like this, right? So it's, people should just really read these things for themselves. Anyway, so Confucianism talks about President Li Tianhui of Taiwan found an emphasis of limited government and traditional Confucianism. Okay, he was able to do that. Confucianism has no concept of civil society, rule of law, individual rights, but it does have tradition of limited government, recognized the right of rebellion against rulers who deviate from the prescribed way, okay, and is religiously tolerant, all right? Islam, basic tenets of Islam have lent themselves more or less to anti-democratic interpretations over time, okay? For example, the Shura and the like. So people have a tendency to interpret this concept of Shura, which is like where you're supposed to like consult with the community, right? And people have a tendency to interpret that as being, for whatever reason, anti-democratic. Okay, you can look at that in your book. But anyway, so given that almost all religions contain some doctrinal elements and seem detrimental to democracy, and others might be conducive to it, we have to look at the empirical question, okay? So there's growing evidence that cultures are invented, obviously, right? Constructed and malleable, right? So it probably is inappropriate to view religions and civilizations as permanently incompatible, okay, with democracy, just as looking at it on its face, okay? Considerable evidence that the stance of different religions towards political institutions oftenly depends less on the content of religious doctrine and more on the interests of religious leaders, okay? So what that means is that typically the way a specific religion is being acted out has more to do with the way that the leaders, the people themselves, are putting it out there. Okay, does that make sense? Because they're the filter that it's being put through. So the empirical truth is that all religions have been historically compatible with a broad range of political institutions. Okay, so despite the claim that Islam requires an Islamic state, it should be noted, with exception of Iran since 1979 and Afghanistan under the Taliban, there have been few historical precedents for mullahs or religious leaders controlling political power in Islamic countries. Okay, it just hasn't happened, and it's not in other countries either. Okay. Evidence for the compatibility of Islam and democracy comes from things like the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan and the Constitution of Medina in 622. Let's see. Despite the fact that cultures tend to be malleable and religions have been compatible with a variety of political institutions, one might still wonder if certain religions are more or less compatible. And a number of recent studies have suggested that Islam is especially bad. I can't, I'm working. Okay. I don't care, I'm working. The results of these studies may be misleading because they examine the effect of Islam on democracy at a fixed point, right? So there's lots of studies that have been done on this, okay? But what they tend to do is that they look at a fixed point of time, right? And they'll say, you know, they'll look at, say, like right now, they'll look at the countries in the world right now in the year 2020 or in the past, say, 10 years or something like this, right? In that time period. And they'll say, you know, based on this study, you know, we say that Islamic countries are more or less likely to become, you know, democracies or something like this, right? But thinking about it from that perspective is the wrong way to think about it, right? So let's look at it this way. So flipping it on its head, right? Despite Huntington's claim, right, that Western civilization is obviously compatible with democracy, this wouldn't have been obvious to somebody living in Western Europe in the 1930s or in Europe in general in the 1930s, right? So if we were just looking at, you know, say we were like looking at Europe in the 1930s, would we have thought that the Western world was compatible with democracy? Right? It was overrun by Nazis, right? There was tons of racism. People were accepting authoritarianism, right? So this quote from Matzauer, it's hard to see the interwar experiment with democracy for the novelty that it was, yet we should certainly not assume that democracy is suited to Europe. Triumphant in 1918, it was virtually extinct 20 years on. Europe found other authoritarian forms of political order no more foreign to its traditions, right? And if we look now, right, and if you look at Freedom House, that site that we've talked about, you see over a time series that democracy and the support for democracy is shrinking now all over the world and even in the United States, right? So it begs the question, right? Is democracy really so suited to the Western world? Is it just, for us, right? Okay. So again, like we said, these particular important times. Today, people argue that Islam is bad for democracy because we don't see as many Islamic democracies. Okay. But we know Protestant and Catholic countries are likely to be democratic, and Muslim countries are likely to be dictatorships today. But this in itself does not establish a causal link between these religions and democracies. What we want to know is whether democracy could be transplanted into countries dominated by different religions. So this requires examining the effect of religion on democracy. So these are the lists of Muslims, Protestant, and Catholic countries. These are the different hypotheses that we would look at. Okay. And this is some of the empirical evidence that we've seen. The hypotheses for the ethnic, religious, and cultural hypotheses. Okay. This is the evidence, all right? And I'll read you what it says. So increased wealth makes transitions to democracy more likely. High economic growth makes transitions to democracy less likely. Countries that are predominantly Catholic are more likely to become democracies. Having Protestant or Muslim majority has no effect on whether a country becomes democratic or not. So that means, okay, that it doesn't matter whether or not a country is Protestant or Muslim, that they have just as much possibility of becoming a democracy or not as one another. Okay, sort of flipping that on its head. All right. Ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity do not appear to impede or aid the emergence of democracy. All right. So real quick, before we go, I want to show you this, because this really sort of encapsulates these stupid, and I couldn't believe it. This was on CNN and I about lost my mind. Okay.
I like Bill Maher. I've been on the show a bunch of times. He's a...
Real quick, this was Reza Aslan. He was on Bill Maher the night before, and they were talking about whether or not there's something inherent about Islam that makes it more or less violent. And Bill Maher insisted that Islam is more violent, and Reza Aslan about lost his mind.
But frankly, when it comes to the top,
I gotta share this with you. Hold on. New share.
of religion, he's not very sophisticated in the way that he thinks. I mean, the argument about the female genital mutilation being an Islamic problem is a perfect example of that. It's not an Islamic problem, it's an African problem.
Well, wait, because he says it's a, hold on a second, because he says it's a Muslim country problem. He says that in Somalia.
Yeah, but and that's actually empirically, factually incorrect. It's a Central African problem. Eritrea has almost 90% female genital mutilation. It's a Christian country. Ethiopia has 75% female genital mutilation. it's a Christian country. Nowhere else in the Muslim majority states is female genital mutilation an issue. But again, this is the problem, is that you make these facile arguments like that women are somehow mistreated in the Muslim world. Well, that's certainly true in many Muslim majority countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Do you know that Muslims have elected 7 women as their heads of states in those Muslim majority countries? How many women
But it is
do
not,
we have
but
as head
for the
of
most
states
part,
in the United States?
Reza, be honest, though, for the most part, it is not a free and open society for women in those states.
Well, it's not in Iran. It's not in Saudi Arabia. It certainly is in Indonesia and Malaysia. It certainly is in Bangladesh. It certainly is in Turkey. I mean, again, this is the problem, is that you're talking about a religion of 1.5 billion people, and certainly it becomes very easy to just simply paint them all with a single brush by saying, well, in Saudi Arabia, they can't drive, and so therefore that's
This was
somehow
before
representative
it was
of Islam.
legal
It's representative
to
of
drive
Saudi
in
Arabia.
Saudi
But
Arabia.
In
hold on, I
Iran,
think-
they don't have.
I mean, I think that Bill Maher's point is that these aren't extremists. We often talk about extremists and that we should crack down on extremists. And why aren't Muslims speaking out about extremists? In Saudi Arabia, when women can't vote and they can't drive and they need permission from their husband, that's not extremist. Why aren't we talking more about what? That's not extremist. That's commonplace. Why don't we talk more about the commonplace wrongs that are happening in some of these countries?
It's extremist when compared to the rights and responsibilities of women, Muslim women around the world. It's an extremist way of dealing
But
with
it's not
it. Of course, we don't
extremist in
seem to
that. It's
care
not
because
extremist
Saudi
in that
Arabia-
country. In Saudi Arabia, that's the norm.
Oh,
Yeah,
no,
that's
it's
what you're
not.
saying.
I mean, look, Saudi Arabia is one of the most, if not the most extremist Muslim country in the world. In the month that we've been talking about ISIS and their terrible actions in Iraq and Syria, Saudi Arabia, our closest ally, has beheaded 19 people. Nobody seems to care about that because Saudi Arabia sort of preserves our national interests. You know,
Okay.
this is the problem, is that these kinds of conversations that we're having aren't really being had in any kind of legitimate way. We're not talking about women in the Muslim world. We're using 2 or 3 examples to justify a generalization. That's actually the definition of bigotry.
All right, fair enough. Let's listen to Benjamin Netanyahu at the United Nations today.
So when it comes to their ultimate goals, Hamas is ISIS and ISIS is Hamas. And what they share in common, all militant Islamists share in common.
So Reza, the question at the bottom of the screen that everyone is looking at. Does Islam promote violence?
Islam doesn't promote violence or peace. Islam is just a religion, and like every religion in the world, it depends on what you bring to it. If you're a violent person, your Islam, your Judaism, your Christianity, your Hinduism is going to be violent. There are marauding Buddhist monks in Myanmar slaughtering women and children. Does Buddhism promote violence? Of course not. People are violent or peaceful, and that depends on their politics, their social world, the way that they see their communities, the way they see themselves.
So Reza, you don't think that there's anything more, there's the justice system in Muslim countries, you don't think is somehow more primitive or subjugates women more than in other countries?
Did you hear what you just said? You said in Muslim countries. I just told you that Indonesia, women are absolutely 100% equal to men. In Turkey, they have had more female representatives, more female heads of state in Turkey than we have in the United
Yes, but
States.
in Pakistan,
Stop saying things like Muslim countries.
Women are still being stoned.
And that's
to
a
death.
problem for Pakistan. You're
So in
right.
other words,
So let's
I
criticize
just
Pakistan.
want to be clear on what your point is, because I thought you and Bill Maher were saying the same thing. Your point is that Muslim countries are not to blame. There is nothing particular, there's no common thread in Muslim countries. You can't paint with a broad brush that somehow their justice system or Sharia law or what they're doing in terms of stoning and female mutilation is different than in other countries like Western countries.
Mm-hmm. Stoning and mutilation and those barbaric practices should be condemned and criticized by everyone. The actions of individuals and societies and countries like Iran, like Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia must be condemned because they don't belong in the 21st century. But to say Muslim countries as though Pakistan and Turkey are the same, as though Indonesia and Saudi Arabia are the same, as though somehow what is happening in the most extreme forms of these repressive countries, these autocratic countries, is representative of what's happening in every other Muslim country, is frankly, and I use this word seriously, stupid. So let's stop doing it.
Just to clarify, if you don't know, Reza Aslan, he has a PhD in religious studies. While he's Muslim himself, his specialty is actually Christianity. And that's why the book that you see at the bottom, that he wrote was about Jesus, right? And but anyway, so that's why he's considered like an expert on religion, right? So anyway, so I just wanted to show you that because it's an interesting discussion and kind of, shows how people can sort of betray their prejudices and, maybe, I don't know, sort of think about the way that when you talk to people, maybe hear the way people speak about things, right? And, recognize when people might be saying things that one might be bigoted or incorrect, factually incorrect. So I think that there's a lot of misconceptions, particularly about Muslims, but too, like, for example, they were talking about stoning and stuff like that. That happens in Christian countries too, particularly like in Africa and stuff like that. So it's not just, fair to put that on Muslims. And as they were talking about the female genital mutilation, that's really an African thing. It's not a Muslim thing. So it's important to, get these things correct. But anyway, so that's it for this chapter. If does anybody have any questions before I let you go? No questions? Okay. I have to edit the other video. I've been kind of sick, so I didn't do it on Friday. There was something I needed to edit out per somebody's request. So anyway, I will do that, and I'll put this one up and the other one up later today. All right. And if you have any questions, of course, just email me. Okay. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for coming and sticking it out. I appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you.
No
Bye.
problem. Bye.